The soft, peaceful morning in Pasadena was shattered by a voice that cut through the stillness like a crack of thunder. "Don't open that door, mister. Someone was under your car this morning." Jonathan Reese, a man used to controlling every aspect of his life, froze mid-motion, his hand still resting on the polished handle of his slate gray Porsche. The car gleamed under the California sun, its mirror-like finish a symbol of his wealth and power. But in that moment, it felt fragile. He blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly, and glanced across the street. A small black girl, no older than 8, stood barefoot on her front lawn, her messy curls wild and her purple pajama pants sagging slightly at her waist. She clutched a sketch pad in one hand, her eyes wide with a kind of fear Jonathan couldn't quite place. It wasn't mischief, it wasn't play. This was the real thing. He frowned, stepping closer. "What did you say?" The girl took a hesitant step forward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I saw him. A man. He had gloves on. He was under your car before sunrise." Her voice faltered, barely above a whisper, the words heavy with something Jonathan couldn't ignore. "I think he put something there." His instincts, sharpened over years of navigating boardrooms and business deals, balked at the absurdity of the situation. A bomb under his car? It didn't make sense. He was due in San Diego in less than an hour for the opening of a new satellite office, the kind of low-key launch he preferred. No security convoy, no assistance, just the open road and a thumb drive loaded with his speech. But the look on the girl's face stopped him in his tracks. There was something about her quiet desperation, her willingness to risk speaking to a stranger, a man who had everything, just to warn him. He crouched, peering beneath the car. At first, there was nothing. Then, just behind the front axle, he saw it. A glint of black metal, a faint red pulse of light blinking in the early morning shadow, like a heartbeat of impending disaster. His breath hitched. Slowly, his hand reached for his phone, fingers stiff with disbelief. "Graves," he said, his voice steady despite the cold twist in his gut. "I need you at the Pasadena house. Bring everyone." The next 22 minutes were a blur, 2 black SUVs screeching to a halt, doors opening with military precision, and 4 of his personal security team, clad in tactical gear, spilling into the street. The air was still. The only sound was the distant chirp of birds greeting the new day. Agent McCrae, his lead security officer, crouched beside him, her face set in grim determination. "It's a motion-sensitive explosive," she said, her voice clipped. "Triggered by pressure and acceleration. If you'd hit the gas, sir." Jonathan's mouth went dry. The only thing between him and death was a small girl who had done what no one else would. He turned slowly, his gaze catching the girl once more. Zara Ellis. She stood across the street, still hiding behind a hydrangea bush, her sketch pad pressed tight to her chest. Jonathan crossed the street, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's your name?" he asked softly. Zara looked up at him, wary, her eyes wide but unblinking. "Zaria Ellis." "How old are you, Zariah?" 8. "You live here?" Zara nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "With my mom. She works nights." She paused, and Jonathan could see her chest rising and falling with the effort to keep calm. "I was awake early. I draw in the mornings. I saw the man. He had a hood. He kept looking over his shoulder." Jonathan crouched down to her level, feeling something unfamiliar stir in his chest. He wasn't good with kids. Never had the patience. But something about this one, this brave, frightened child who had spoken up when no one else would, hit him in a way he couldn't explain. "You saved my life," Jonathan said quietly. Zara blinked, looking at him as if unsure what to do with his words. "I wasn't sure. I almost didn't say anything." "But you did," Jonathan replied. "That's what matters." Behind them, the bomb squad arrived, and the police cordoned off the area. Neighbors began to gather in their windows, confused and concerned. Jonathan stood, still watching the girl, the weight of her quiet courage settling over him like a mantle. And then she handed him the drawing she had been working on. The crude lines were unmistakable. The Porsche in the driveway, the man in the hoodie crouched beneath it. But what caught Jonathan's eye was the detail on the wrist, the small pendant hanging from it, shaped like a letter. His breath caught in his throat. "May I see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zara handed him the sketch without a word, and as Jonathan studied it, the sense of dread deepened. The letter on the pendant was unmistakable, a K. A chill ran down his spine. He turned to Graves, who had just finished a quiet call. I want security footage from every house on this block, Jonathan said, his voice now taut with a new urgency. Run facial recognition on every match. Get me everything on this girl's family. I don't care how. Just get it. Graves hesitated but nodded. Right away, sir. Zara still stood silently, a quiet witness to everything unfolding around her. She didn't smile. She didn't ask for thanks. She simply watched, like a sentinel keeping vigil. And Jonathan Reese, the millionaire, the self-made mogul, felt something shift deep inside him, a small, fragile thing that he'd nearly lost. Hope. The investigation began with an eerie calm, the tension palpable in the air. Jonathan stood at the edge of his driveway, still trying to wrap his mind around what had just happened. The bomb squad had already cordoned off the area, their flashing lights cutting through the morning fog. The street, once so quiet, now felt like a battlefield. Graves, ever the professional, was already in motion, coordinating with his team to gather the necessary intel. Jonathan's mind raced, thoughts swirling like a whirlwind. The girl's words echoed in his head, her frightened yet determined voice lingering. I saw him. He had gloves on. He was under your car before sunrise. It wasn't just her warning that sent chills down his spine, but the certainty in her eyes. Something wasn't right. Something was very wrong. As the minutes stretched on, the bomb squad went to work, carefully disarming the explosive. McCrae, the lead agent, had already assessed the situation and confirmed what Jonathan had feared. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a calculated, methodical attempt on his life. The bomb had been designed to go off the moment the car moved, triggered by pressure and acceleration. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken at the thought of what could have happened if he had gotten into the car just moments earlier. He might not be standing here now, asking questions, or trying to make sense of this madness. His gaze drifted to the little girl again, still standing by the hydrangea bush, her sketch pad pressed tightly against her chest like some kind of shield. She hadn't moved, not once, as if frozen by the gravity of the moment. Jonathan could see the faintest tremble in her hands, but she didn't cry out. She didn't seek attention. She just stood there, watching, the way a soldier might watch the enemy. It was unnerving, yet there was something else in her gaze, something that spoke of bravery far beyond her years. Jonathan walked toward her slowly, the weight of her quiet strength settling on him. He crouched to her level, trying to offer a sense of normalcy, but she wasn't looking for comfort. She was simply waiting for him to acknowledge the truth. What else did you see? He asked, his voice soft but steady. Zara shifted slightly, glancing at the sketchpad in her hands. The man, she began, her voice small but clear. He was looking over his shoulder like he was making sure no one saw him. He had a hoodie on, and his hands were covered in gloves, like he was hiding something. Her eyes met his for a moment, and Jonathan could see the weight of the knowledge in them. I thought maybe he was stealing something, but then I saw the wires and the light. It was blinking. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. I thought it was a bomb. Jonathan's heart sank. The drawing she had given him earlier flashed in his mind again. The figure in the hoodie crouched beneath his car, the chain with a small pendant dangling from the wrist. A K, Jonathan thought. Karen. The pieces were falling into place faster than he could process. He could feel his breath hitch as his mind went into overdrive. The necklace, the limp in the man's walk, the connection to Karen, it all pointed to a horrifying truth he hadn't yet fully grasped. He turned back to Graves, who had finished his call and was approaching with a grim expression. Get me the security footage from every house on this block, Jonathan ordered, his voice low but urgent. Run facial recognition. I want matches, and I want them now. Graves nodded, his expression hardening. Right away, sir. Jonathan glanced back at Zara, who was still standing in the same spot, her eyes never leaving him. He saw her hands tremble again, but she didn't move, didn't flinch. For a moment, he simply stood there, absorbing the enormity of what had just occurred. If Zara hadn't spoken up, he would have walked straight into the trap. The thought of it gnawed at him, and he found himself staring at her, the weight of her quiet courage settling over him like a mantle. He stepped closer, crouching down so they were eye level. What's your name? He asked, his voice almost gentle. Zariah, she answered softly, her gaze unwavering. He nodded, a flicker of gratitude crossing his face. Thank you, Zariah. You saved my life today. Zariah blinked, the words clearly surprising her. She looked at him unsure, then shifted her gaze to the ground. I wasn't sure, she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. I almost didn't say anything. But you did, Jonathan said, his tone firm. That's what matters. You did. For a brief moment, their eyes met again, and in that instant, Jonathan knew something had changed within him. It wasn't the bomb that had nearly killed him. It was the realization that in this world, sometimes the smallest voices could make the biggest difference. As Graves moved past him, signaling that the situation was under control, Jonathan stood slowly, his thoughts still on the girl in front of him. Her courage was a reminder of everything he had lost sight of. In a world full of noise, Zara's voice was the one that cut through the static, the one that saved him. He watched as the bomb squad finished clearing the area, and for the first time in a long while, Jonathan Reese felt a spark of hope. Maybe he hadn't lost everything after all. The discovery of the bomb was just the beginning. As Jonathan sat in his study later that evening, the gravity of what had nearly happened began to sink in. But there was something more. The sketch in his hand, Zara's crude lines, the K on the pendant. It gnawed at him. His mind raced through a dozen different scenarios, none of them comforting. That chain, that letter, it was too familiar. It was the same pendant Karen had worn for years, the one he had given her when Reese hit its first $1 million in revenue. The one she'd proudly said reminded her of where it all started. But now, it felt like a cruel joke. Jonathan had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to see through the noise and spot the truth. But in the last few hours, the truth had eluded him. He had trusted his wife, his partner in everything, for so long. They had built Reese Tech together. She had stood by him through it all. The sleepless nights, the battles, the triumphs. But now, with the faint red pulse of a bomb blinking before his eyes and the chain dangling in the drawing, everything felt like a betrayal of the highest order. He couldn't shake the image of Karen's face as he'd seen it in the past few months. Distant, distracted, a coldness creeping into the warmth that used to define her. The late nights she claimed were for charity events, the quiet phone calls when she thought he wasn't listening. Had he been too blind to see it? Had she been pulling away from him even before the bomb? The thought twisted in his gut like a knife. Then, as if the universe was pushing him toward the truth, Graves entered the room, holding a manila folder with a USB drive. "We ran the facial recognition, sir," Graves said, his voice low and steady. "No conclusive ID on the footage yet, but we did pull another angle from a Ring camera across the street." He plugged the USB into the TV, and Jonathan watched as the grainy footage from 4:56 a.m. flickered to life. The man was wearing a hoodie, his face obscured, but then the camera caught something, just a glimmer, a reflection of light off a pendant around the man's wrist. Jonathan leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat. The image wasn't clear, but it was unmistakable. A small gold charm in the shape of a K hanging from a delicate chain. The same pendant, the one Karen had worn for years. Karen, Jonathan whispered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. Graves, noticing his reaction, spoke up. "We also ran a background check on the girl, Zariah Ellis. She's from a single-parent home. Her mother, Marcia, works the night shift at Huntington Memorial. No criminal record, no issues at school. The girl's a quiet observer, but gifted." Jonathan barely heard him. His thoughts were consumed by what the footage meant. The man under his car, the connection to Karen, the pendant. It was all leading somewhere dark, somewhere he wasn't sure he wanted to go. But then the next bombshell came. Graves set another file on the desk. "We pulled Karen's travel records," he said, his voice even. 3 trips to San Francisco in the last 6 months. All of them coincided with conferences hosted by Merrick Data Solutions. Jonathan's blood ran cold. "Kyle Merrick," he muttered under his breath. The name was like a ghost from the past, a failed lawsuit, a bitter rivalry that Jonathan had long thought buried. Kyle had sued him years ago for idea theft, but the case was dropped. Jonathan had always suspected that Kyle was just a pawn, a man manipulated by someone far more dangerous. He'd never suspected that someone might be Karen. Graves didn't hesitate. "We found out they were staying at the same hotel, 2 floors apart. Kyle Merrick hasn't been in the picture for years, but Karen's been meeting him in secret." Jonathan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The room spun, the weight of the betrayal settling heavily in his chest. His world, once built on trust and logic, now seemed like a fragile house of cards. Every conversation he'd had with Karen in the last few months, every look, every quiet moment, suddenly took on new meaning. Graves, watching him closely, asked, "What do you want to do now?" Jonathan's voice was low, controlled, but there was a fire behind his words. "I want everything on Karen. Every contact, every meeting, every call. We're going to find out how deep this goes. And I want every detail on Kyle Merrick. If he's involved, I want to know it all." Graves nodded, already moving to execute the next phase of their investigation. But Jonathan didn't move. He stood still for a moment, staring out the window, the realization sinking in like a slow-moving tide. Karen, he thought again. My wife. She's the one who put all this into motion. It wasn't just the man under the car. It wasn't just the bomb. It was the years of trust, the life they had built together that had been shattered by a single, horrifying truth. Jonathan didn't know what hurt more, the threat to his life or the realization that the woman he had loved, the woman who had stood beside him through it all, might have been the one pulling the strings all along. He looked down at the sketch Zara had given him, the lines still crude but sharp in their truth, the pendant, the K. He gripped it tightly, as though the paper might offer some clue to unraveling the mess his life had become. But there was no answer. Only the quiet, inevitable pull of the truth. And in that moment, Jonathan realized he couldn't unsee it, couldn't escape it. His world had changed forever. The night was thick with silence as Jonathan sat alone in his study, the weight of the discovery settling like a storm cloud. His thoughts churned in slow, agonizing circles, the truth about Karen slowly unraveling in his mind. She had betrayed him in the most insidious way possible. No longer just a partner in business, but a cold, calculating player in a game of betrayal that stretched far beyond anything he had imagined. The realization was a slow burn, gnawing at him with each passing second. The woman he had trusted with everything, his equal in every way, had conspired against him, plotting not just to steal his company, but to end his life. The thought was almost too much to bear, but there was no denying it anymore. Karen's absence from their home had always felt like a subtle crack in their marriage, but it had never been loud enough for him to hear. The late nights, the secret phone calls, the careful conversations with Kyle Merrick, all of it had slipped under his radar, buried beneath the demands of running Reese Tech. He had been too absorbed in his world of profits, strategy, and power to see the signs. But now, the pieces were falling into place in terrifying clarity. The bomb, the pendant, the secret meetings with Merrick, they all pointed back to her. She had never really been the partner he thought she was. She had never truly stood beside him. She had only been playing a part in a much darker play. Jonathan stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and paced to the window, his mind racing. The night outside seemed to press in on him, the dark cityscape below oblivious to the war raging inside him. His reflection in the glass seemed distant, distorted, as if he no longer recognized himself. The man who had built this empire, who had lived with conviction and control, felt like a stranger in his own skin. How could he have been so blind? How could he have missed it all? His thoughts were interrupted by Graves's quiet entrance, the sound of the door closing behind him, pulling Jonathan back into the present. Graves didn't say anything at first. He simply placed a folder on the desk and looked at Jonathan, waiting for him to speak. But Jonathan's thoughts were still tangled in the truth he had uncovered, and it took him a moment to gather himself. He didn't need to ask. He knew what the next piece of the puzzle would be. Graves didn't waste any time. "We've confirmed everything, sir. The money trail from Karen's meetings with Merrick leads straight to a shell company she set up months ago. There's a clear link between her and the payments to Devin Merrick. And we have confirmation that she increased your life insurance payout shortly before the bomb was planted. She was preparing for your death, Jonathan." Jonathan's heart thudded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. The words were cold, but not unexpected. The final confirmation that Karen had set everything in motion hit him like a blow to the gut, but he had already known it in his bones. He stood still, staring at the papers in front of him, the quiet ache in his chest growing sharper. I want to speak to her, Jonathan said, his voice low and steady, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. No one else. Just me. I'll confront her myself. Graves's eyes narrowed, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face. Are you sure about this? It could be dangerous. We can call the authorities. Jonathan's gaze hardened. I'm not calling anyone. This is between me and her. If she thinks she can walk away from this unscathed, she's wrong. Graves nodded, sensing the resolve in Jonathan's tone. Understood, sir. I'll make sure we're ready for whatever happens. Jonathan didn't waste another moment. He grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, the fabric heavy in his hands, and walked toward the door. His mind was made up. He wasn't going to let Karen manipulate him any longer. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. As he stepped out of the study and into the night, he felt the cold air bite at his skin, sharp and unforgiving. But it wasn't just the chill that gripped him. It was the sharp clarity of what was to come. He was going to face her, to make her admit the truth, no matter the cost. His phone buzzed in his pocket as he walked toward the car, the sound of the message startling him out of his thoughts. It was Graves. The location is set, sir. She's at the house. Everything is ready. Jonathan glanced at the message, a chill crawling up his spine. This was it. The moment he'd been avoiding for months, the moment where everything would either crumble or rebuild. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. As the car pulled away from the estate and into the night, Jonathan felt the weight of everything he had built resting squarely on his shoulders. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, he would confront it head on. He would face Karen, not as the man she thought she knew, but as someone who had learned the hard way that trust could be shattered in an instant. The man he had been, the man who had trusted her, loved her, was gone. The man who faced the truth, no matter the cost, was the one driving toward her now. And when he walked through that door, he would get the answers he needed, no matter how much it destroyed him. The morning after Jonathan's confrontation with Karen, the weight of the night still pressed heavily on his chest. The world outside his office window was bustling with the usual frenzy, but inside, a quiet stillness had taken over. He had faced the truth, but what now? What was left after all the lies had been exposed, after the woman he had loved had betrayed him in ways he could scarcely comprehend? Jonathan stood at the window for a long time, staring out at the city below, its lights flickering like stars in the early morning haze. The same city that had once symbolized everything he had built now felt like a cold, indifferent backdrop to his personal collapse. But even in the depth of his despair, something had shifted in him. He could no longer play the role of the victim, the man who had been wronged. He couldn't afford the luxury of bitterness or self-pity. The world had shown him how fragile everything could be, how quickly loyalty could turn into manipulation. And in that moment of clarity, Jonathan realized he had two choices: to wallow in the wreckage of his marriage or to rise from it and rebuild, not just his company, but himself. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. Graves was on the other end, his voice steady but urgent. "We've found something else, sir. It's about Zariah." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. "What about her?" Graves paused before speaking. "The footage you requested, sir, her mother, Marcia Ellis. We ran a background check. She's had a rough life, but she's clean. What's interesting is what we found in Zariah's school records. The girl is gifted, beyond her years, actually. She's been an outlier in her class, a silent observer. And her teachers, they all say the same thing. She's the kind of kid who sees things others miss." Jonathan felt a strange tug at his chest. The girl had saved his life, but her bravery, her perception, now felt like something more. It wasn't just about a bomb under a car. Zariah had seen something deeper. She had seen the truth, the kind of truth Jonathan himself had been blind to. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He opened it to find one of the board members standing in the doorway, his face pale with apprehension. "Mr. Reese," the man said, his voice shaky. "We need to talk." Jonathan nodded and gestured for him to come in, closing the door behind them. The board member handed him a thick file, his hands trembling. Jonathan opened it slowly, scanning the contents. It was a report on the company's recent financial projections, nothing extraordinary at first glance. But as his eyes ran over the numbers, something clicked. The margins had been stretched, the figures manipulated. This wasn't just business as usual. Karen's influence, her reach, had seeped into everything, into the very foundation of Reese Tech. The betrayal ran deeper than he had imagined. Karen had set the stage for her own ascension, not just by attempting to remove him from the company, but by slowly and quietly manipulating the company's growth and strategy. She had been working behind the scenes, pulling strings, shifting resources, and positioning herself to take over once he was gone. Jonathan's mind was racing now. He had been too consumed by personal betrayal to see how deeply it had affected everything. The company, his legacy, had been compromised long before the bomb had been planted. This was the true cost of her deceit, not just his life, but the very future of Reese Tech. He slammed the file shut, his knuckles white with the pressure. The time for playing it safe, for trying to preserve the company's image, was over. He had been too passive, too forgiving. It was time to take control back, to fix the damage that had been done. He turned back to the phone, his fingers dialing the number without hesitation. Graves answered after 2 rings. Graves, we're going to clean house, quietly. Every floor, every office, every team member who's been compromised. I want full transparency from now on. No more secrets. Graves didn't question him. Understood, sir. We'll start immediately. As Jonathan hung up the phone, the weight of the decision felt like a weight lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming his life, his company, his purpose. He couldn't change the past, but he could control what came next. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and rapid-fire decisions. But even as the chaos of the office swirled around him, Jonathan kept coming back to one thought. Zariah. Her quiet courage had awakened something in him. Something he hadn't realized he had lost until now. It was the will to fight, to protect, and to rebuild. By the time evening fell, Jonathan stood once more in front of the mirror in his office, his reflection staring back at him. The man he saw now was different from the one who had walked into that meeting months ago, naive and trusting. That man was gone. And in his place stood someone who understood, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to truly fight for something worth protecting. Jonathan Reese wasn't just the CEO of Reese Tech anymore. He was the man who had survived betrayal, and now he was going to rebuild everything, starting with the one thing that truly mattered, the truth. And he would make sure it would never be buried again. Jonathan stood at the center of the boardroom, the tension thick in the air. His footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, the weight of what was about to unfold pressing down on him with every step. The room was filled with his executive team, their faces a blend of uncertainty and curiosity. He hadn't called a meeting like this in years, but today was different. Today, everything had to change. He looked around the room at the people who had once stood by him, now watching him with wary eyes. The glimmer of respect that used to fill these walls had been replaced with suspicion, whispers hidden behind polite smiles. And that, he knew, had been his fault. He had built an empire, but he had neglected the people inside it. He had let the work, the numbers, the strategy overshadow the most important thing: trust. He took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium, his hands steady despite the chaos swirling in his chest. He glanced at the screen behind him, but there would be no slides today. No carefully curated numbers or polished projections. The truth, he realized, was raw, unpolished, and far more powerful than any slide could ever be. "Good morning," he began, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the room. His gaze swept across the faces before him, familiar yet distant. "I know many of you have been wondering about the recent developments. I know you've seen the rumors, the whispers about my health, about my future here at Reese Tech. But I want to make one thing clear. Those rumors are true." A ripple of murmurs spread across the room, and Jonathan's chest tightened. It wasn't the truth they were expecting. He wasn't here to explain his health or to play the role of a victim. He wasn't here to offer any easy answers. "I've been absent," he continued, his voice steady but tinged with something heavier. "Not just physically, but mentally. I've been consumed with the wrong things. Profits, expansion, success. I've neglected the very people who built this company. I've ignored the signs of something far more important than business strategy, the people who make this company what it is." He paused, letting the words sink in. The silence in the room was suffocating. But Jonathan didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of it. In that silence, there was power, a power he had long forgotten. "You've all heard about Karen, about the plot against me," he said, the words heavy, laden with the weight of betrayal. "What I haven't told you is how much I ignored, how much I overlooked. I trusted the wrong people, and in doing so, I failed all of you. I failed this company." A murmur ran through the room again, but this time it wasn't just whispers of shock. There was understanding in those eyes, a recognition that Jonathan had finally, after everything, acknowledged what had been broken all along. "I'm not here to beg for your forgiveness," Jonathan went on, his gaze unwavering. "I'm here because I owe each of you something. I owe you the truth, and I owe you something else too." He paused, his heart pounding, but there was a fire burning in him now, a fire that hadn't been there before. "I owe you a company that values more than just its profits. I owe you a company where trust isn't just a word, but the foundation of everything we do." The room was still now. No one moved. No one spoke. "This company was nearly overtaken by silence," he said quietly, his eyes searching the faces before him. "Not just from those who plotted against it, but from me. I let silence take over. I let you all think I didn't care. But I do. I always have. And from this moment on, we're going to rebuild, starting with the thing I neglected the most, each other." The air in the room shifted. It was subtle, but Jonathan could feel it. A shift in the way the employees were looking at him, not with judgment, not with suspicion, but with something else. It was the beginning of something new, a new understanding, a new commitment. "And we're not stopping there," Jonathan continued, his voice rising with resolve. "Starting next quarter, we're launching the Ellis Fellowship. It will fund full scholarships for children in underserved communities who show exceptional courage and curiosity. We're not just a tech company. We're a company that builds futures, that sees potential in places others overlook." The room remained quiet, but the weight of the moment was palpable. The air felt charged, as though everyone in the room was waiting for something else, something more. Jonathan could sense it. They were waiting to see if he meant it, if this was the beginning of real change or just another empty promise. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on each person. "We don't just need more engineers, more numbers, more innovation. We need more people like Zara Ellis, people who see the world for what it is and are brave enough to act. I want Reese Tech to be known for that, for the courage to act when others hesitate, for the courage to trust when it feels impossible." The applause that followed was hesitant at first, almost as though the room itself was unsure. But then it grew, slow and steady, until it filled the room. Jonathan stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was something else in that applause, a recognition that, for the first time in a long time, he was truly leading again. Not through control, not through force, but through honesty, through vulnerability. And as the last echo of applause died down, Jonathan knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with more challenges than he could count, but he wasn't alone. And this time, he wouldn't face the future with blinders on. He would face it with clarity, with trust, and with the knowledge that the strength of a company didn't just lie in its bottom line. It lay in the people who built it, the people who had always believed in it. He had been lost, but now he was ready to find his way again.